So, right, I'll jump right in. So my research, which I'll present today, is asking the question of how does institutional change occur? So institutions, understood as the rules which govern how societies resources and uphold rights, are central to questions of inclusion, equity, and development. But how institutions arise and change has been a central point of discussion in development studies for the last 10 or more years, as various frameworks and theories have arisen to look at how institutions have been shaping particularly economic development, but also wider questions of development. And one framework which has been really influential in this is, of course, Mushtaq Khan's political settlements analysis, which many of you are probably familiar with, presented in Mushtaq Khan's 2010 paper, and subsequently influencing over a decade of development studies research, and especially within the donor-funded policy research realm. Our political settlements analysis asks us to think about institutions in terms of the power relations which give rise to them. So it moves us beyond institutions themselves to think about, as Mushtaq Khan describes, how they exist in the inherited balance of power for political settlement. So this framework really points us to think about how power relations give force to institutions and shape in whose interest they function. And I'm going to argue that this is a really valuable approach to understanding institutions and institutional change, but that at the same time, it's overly narrow in how power relations themselves are conceived. And this reduces the power of the framework itself to capture how institutional change comes about. And to address this, I propose a cultural political economy approach. Now, this can become rather theoretical and abstract, so I will apply my framework to two case studies of institutional change. One which concerns a struggle for rights and recognition through Nepal's 2015 constitution, which resulted in a transition to federalism, devolving power to marginalized groups in different regions of Nepal. And the second case study looks at a struggle over the rules which govern resources, in particular, a case of the outlawing of metal mining in El Salvador in 2017. So these cases, I think, will show you how a cultural political economy approach to political settlements analysis reveals more of the mechanisms involved in institutional change than is possible through a more narrow conception of power as presented in Khan's political settlements framework. So that's my argument in a nutshell, and I'll now talk you through my thinking in more detail. So Khan's institutional understanding, or Khan's political settlements analysis rather, points us to the relations of power which sit behind institutions, in particular economic and political sources of power, and the interests of actors focused in particular around political survival and the control of rents and resources. Now, Khan was not alone in thinking about how these relations of power shape institutions. His work came as a critique of new institutional economics, and in particular the good governance agenda. So while prominent theorists such as Douglas North, of course, produced really influential work on the political incentives and interests which sit behind institutions, Khan critiqued this approach and really placed emphasis on the economic relations of power. So this was a heterodox political economy approach to understanding institutions, which really emphasized how economic relations of power structure how institutions function, and in particular, how clientelist political institutions enable powerful actors to maintain their preferential access to economic opportunities and political power. Now, I think this is a really valuable critique, and in particular, it shows how clientelist institutions are not a cultural phenomenon alone, nor can they be shifted through simple political decision-making or a shift in values, but that they are a product of a specific political economy. So if this is the case, why would I then want to talk about culture? Well, I think that it's not that political economy relations of power are unimportant. They do carry a lot of explanatory weight. But in focusing only on political economy, we miss half the picture, I would say half the story of how institutional change actually occurs. Because Interests and ideas evolve together if you take a cultural political economy approach, and it requires a greater rebalancing of the framework. You start thinking about agency and contingency in the way that ideas shape actions. So to explain a bit more, I will look at the concept of power in political settlements analysis. So in power, for Kahn, the relations of power which structure how actors shape institutions is around this idea of holding power. And he describes this as the capability of an individual or group to engage and survive in conflicts. And this presents power as power over. It's a very conflictual process and conflictual relationships. It gives structured explanatory power and describes actors' power as being based in economic and political resources, particularly the ability to organise around a shared interests. Ideas in political settlements analysis are described as an instrument which serve economic interests and political survival. So conceiving of power in this way really reduces processes of institutional change to conflict over material self-interest. I would argue that this is overly reductive. We need to also recognise how the power of ideas also inform cognitive templates, moral beliefs, and social norms, which structure how actors decide to act. We also need to recognise cultural forms of power that give status and value to identities and practices, which also shape how people organise politically to change institutions which structure their lives. So to address these limitations, I propose a cultural political economy approach to power. Now, cultural political economy, like political settlements, decenters the analysis from institutions to look at the mechanisms which produce or transform economic systems. However, unlike political settlements analysis, a cultural political economy approach considers the relationship between meanings and practices in generating or changing rules and structures. So culture is a difficult term, it's a rather slippery word, which can be understood in different ways. But in cultural political economy, we refer to culture as the collective production of meaning through which people make sense of their world. So culture is not just about ideas and language, but it's embedded in everyday practices and routines. And so paying attention to culture is about thinking about how meanings inform actions and how actions gain meaning. So this is not a fixed structure or something which is inherent to a particular nationality, for example. It's a process of meaning making. And this is a necessary process through which actors interpret their complex environment and form narratives to guide their actions and interests. So by recognizing this cultural process of meaning making, we start to think about contingency in how people act and the power of ideas to transform their actions and transform structure. So drawing heavily on Summer Jessup's work on cultural political economy theory, I aim to rebalance the materialist and structuralist political economy analysis in Kahn's approach so that the role of agency, ideas, and interpretation can also be taken into account. So while Kahn really rejects quite explicitly culture from political settlements analysis or from a causal explanation for institutional change, I argue that culture is inseparable from political and economic sources of power, and that we need to consider all three to really be able to understand fully how institutional change occurs. So, what would this look like? I guess where Kahn's approach to power is really focused on actors' political and economic sources of power, my approach considers the cultural power as the power of identity, status, and meaning that shapes how actors view their interests and values. So this is a much more expansive concept of power than available in Kahn's approach. And so what it tries to do is examine how ideas as well as interests shape how actors form social groups and seek collective goals regarding the allocation of rights, status, or resources. And this allows an approach or understanding of power as a creative force as well as oppressive. So moves away from the only conflictual approach and understanding of power in Kahn's political settlements analysis to allow power to be critical and even counter-hegemonic. And these kind of ideas, or this approach to political settlements, draws on the work of others in the political settlement community. Tom Lavis and Sam Hickey on the role of ideas in policy change, Hazel Gray's work on how ideology can shape economic transformation, and Tim Kelsall and colleagues' work on the disruptive potential of marginalised groups. However, how my approach is different is the focus on power itself, which is central to political settlements theory. And by repositioning how power is understood, I aim to show that this approach can enable a greater range of the mechanisms involved in institutional change to be identified and understood. So this is all rather theory heavy. So I'll now talk you through 2 case studies which apply this approach. And I'll try to show how my approach is different to the kind of analysis which you would get with Kahn's political settlements approach instead. So in applying the framework, I have 2 case studies, as I mentioned at the beginning. And these were carried out using a process tracing methodology. So trying to identify the causal process of change which produced the 2 institutional changes in each case. And these were based on secondary literature review and document analysis, as well as for the Nepal case, 6 weeks of primary research involving over 60 interviews with members of the political movement involved in that case. Now, I chose these 2 cases, which might seem rather disparate choices, but I chose them because they are examples of both a most likely and a least likely test case for my theory. The Nepal case concerns a struggle for rights in this transition to federalism, and it concerns a marginalised ethnic group seeking greater rights and recognition and inclusion in the constitution. So this, I think, is a most likely test case for my approach, because it concerns non-material goal and a movement which is organised around an identity. Whereas the El Salvador case, I guess, is a least likely test case because it concerns a conflict over access to resources. So will probably be better explained by a materialist political economy approach. So by applying my framework to both cases, I aim to show how cultural political economy is important regardless of the specific nature of the institutional change. So, to the cases. My first case involving Nepal 2015 constitution is an example of how an institutional shift occurred towards the greater distribution of rights and recognition, as well as a devolution of power to a marginalised group. Now, in this case, the cultural and political power of the marginalised group, the Madesi, increased enough to force the implementation of the federal system of government in Nepal, as well as reservations for marginalised groups in all public bodies. So, to give a bit of background to the case, the Madesi are an ethnic group from the southern plain region of Nepal, the Terai, and they have long been marginalised from the Nepali state, which is controlled by the Kathmandu-based elite, who built the Nepali national identity in the cultural image of the upper caste Hindu hill population. However, during the Maoist uprising and decade-long civil war, which began in 1996 in Nepal, Madesi people were mobilized by the Maoists into confronting the then ruling elite. The Maoists mobilized the Madesi as well as other ethnic groups around an agenda of ethnic federalism and promised ethnic autonomous regions. However, before the civil war had ended, a large Madesi separate movement had broken away from the Maoists and were focused specifically on gaining their own ethnic autonomous region. So this particular this Madesi movement, which was emerging out of the Maoist civil war, was really focused on an agenda of political inclusion and rights, rather than the more radical agenda of redistribution, which the Maoists were leading. And so the Madesi movement was led by middle-class Madesis, who were clearly threatened by the more radical Maoist agenda, and instead focused the Medesi movement around this movement for identity and emancipation based on ethnic identity. By the end of the Civil War, the ruling elite were weakened and forced into negotiating with the Maoists and with the Medesi. And after a very long process of negotiation over the constitution, in 2015, a final constitution was agreed, which, as the Medesi had demanded, transformed Nepal into a federal system, including one state in the Medesi-dominant region, as well as reservations for the Medesi and other marginalized ethnic and caste groups. So this is really a simplification of a very long and contested political process. And certainly the Medesi did not achieve all of their demands. But what it did definitely achieve was the devolution of power to a region, a shift in recognition of the Medesi and Nepali, and enabled Medesi to become kingmakers in Nepali politics. So how would this process of institutional change be explained by a cultural political economy approach to political settlements? And how would it differ from Khan's approach? So I think Khan's approach would clearly identify how the political security and economic interests of the Medesi political leaders were motivating their organizing of the Medesi movement, that their fear of the Maoist agenda of land redistribution prevented the Medesi movement from having a more redistributive or developmental agenda within the Medesi region itself. And certainly there were leaders, if not all, but some leaders of the Medesi political movement were focused on competing with the hill elite or the Kathmandu elite over a share of political power and rents, and not necessarily focused on a more radical shift in power within Nepal. However, while I think this is these kind of insights developed through a Khan's approach are really important, I think that a cultural political economy approach will add further important aspects to the analysis. So how and why Medesi people mobilized around an agenda for identity and recognition and not the more radical Maoist agenda shows that identity is not just a tool through which people are manipulated into political organization, but shows that cultural identity and justice carries a lot of meaning. In this case, I think moral beliefs about the rightful position of the Medesi within Nepali society were really powerful in motivating a sustained political movement around the Medesi identity. The shared experience of discrimination, humiliation, and injustice mobilized Medesis from different caste and economic groups within the Medes. And without this, I do not think that this institutional shift towards federalism would have occurred. So I think the Menethi writer C.K. Lal's quote here captures what was happening, saying that the grievances of the Terai activists and the Terais, the Medes, are not just political rhetoric. In a democracy, everyone desires a place of honor at the central table, and anything less merely whets their appetite. So I think this kind of shows how ideas of justice and fairness, combined with a desire for honor and status and a belief in transformation, resulted in this significant institutional change in which resources and social status were allocated differently across Nepali society. So this case, as I mentioned, being a struggle for rights, may be an obvious case for demonstrating the relevance of cultural political economy to understanding institutional change. So how about a more difficult case involving resources and the struggle over the opportunity to generate wealth? So I'll now take you through the El Salvador case. So in this case, we see how the mining ban, which was introduced in 2017 in El Salvador, was not reducible only to a conflict over material interests, but also involved ideas, identity, and status. So take you back to the early 2000s, mineral prices were rising significantly, and this attracted foreign mining companies to El Salvador's gold deposits in the north of El Salvador. And as foreign mining companies began developing gold mining in rather impoverished impoverished region of El Salvador, the local communities in the mining area began to protest. Their livelihoods were being threatened by water pollution in their local area. And quickly a campaign developed to ban mining in El Salvador. And this was a campaign group formed mainly of people from the region and whose livelihoods were being affected. And they framed the campaign as a nationalist campaign, despite it really concerning their immediate livelihoods. And they framed it as a campaign which was important because it would protect a particular watershed, the Lempa watershed, which was important for all of El Salvador. And so developing a patriotic framing managed to align sort of left-wing ideas of prosperity and harmony with nature, which were popular at the time, with right-wing nationalist views on the value of the water source. Now, surprisingly, as this campaign was growing, the conservative leader of the Catholic Church in El Salvador, the Archbishop of San Salvador, came out in support of the campaign. And this was surprising because the Catholic Church in El Salvador is particularly divided between left-wing liberation theologist priests who had been aligned with the left-wing rebels during the Civil War, and the more conservative branch of the Catholic Church, which had sustained or maintained and supported the political elite at the time. So despite this difference in political allegiance, the Archbishop of San Salvador called on the government to ban mining, arguing that it was important to protect everybody's home, and gave religious meaning to the need for a ban on metal mining. This really gave significant moral authority as well as political salience to the anti-mining campaign. And just prior to the national elections in 2007, a de facto mining ban was introduced, in which the government declared that it would not process any more applications for mining until environmental assessments had been carried out. Nevertheless, the government at the time lost the elections, and a more radical left-wing government came to power and was faced with the decision of whether to push forward the de facto ban into law or not. However, as feared by the government, just after coming into power, one of the mining companies, Pacific Rim, a Canadian mining company, decided to sue El Salvador for lost investments. And the case went to the World Bank Center for the settlement of investment disputes. The case dragged on, but by 2016, a ruling was finally made. And surprisingly, the ruling declared that the Pacific Rim, the mining company, had not gained the necessary permission from local landowners to begin mining. And so the legal threat was dismissed. This left the way open for civil society campaigners, and again, particularly the Catholic Church, to push the government into turning this metal mining ban into law. And this was achieved in 2017. So again, that was a rapid and brief explanation of a much longer story. But I think this is an unusual case in which those with more economic power lost an opportunity to generate profit from a natural resource. And so it calls into question how we understand power relations in the process of institutional change. If we pay attention only to economic and political sources of power, we don't have a full answer to how and why the rules around metal mining in El Salvador changed, protecting the interests of a small and politically normally less powerful and impoverished group of El Salvadorians in the north of El Salvador, despite the potential profit or revenue which the government could have benefited from. So to understand this, we can see how the pro-market government had at first, as expected, facilitated foreign capital's access to gold mining. But as the anti-mining campaign had grown, the political and cultural power of the anti-mining coalition had also grown. And this began to outweigh the economic power of the mining companies. In particular, the cultural power of the Catholic Church was able to bridge the historically opposing identity groups and frame the mining ban in a narrative that resonated with the ideas and values of left and right-wing groups. this narrative was able to resonate with the transnational discourse of anti-globalization and anti-capitalism, which was promoted by left-wing groups at the time. So this was the time of the pink wave in Latin America. And it was also important to note that the mining companies' economic power did not translate into domestic political power, because the foreign companies had not managed to create partnerships with local domestic economic actors, some of whom were also concerned about water pollution. So this case, I think, shows how multiple factors, from cultural as well as political and economic sources of power, were shaping the process of institutional change. By taking a cultural political economy approach, we can see how ideas and interests can develop and allow a coalition to form around a shared narrative that challenges existing institutions. So why would we take this cultural political economy approach to political assessment analysis? What I hope that these two brief cases show is that if we recognise how people mobilise around ideas of justice and identity, not just interests, we have a fuller understanding of how institutions are transformed. Shifts in how resources are governed and rights are protected are not just a reflection of material and political interests and structures, but are also produced through moral judgment, shared beliefs, identities, and alliance building. So these two cases of subaltern actors collaborating to increase their power and shift institutions that have marginalised them economically, culturally, and politically were possible not just through the control of land or resources, but also through drawing on narratives and building on status and using values which were important and resonated beyond one particular group. So I think that adopting a cultural political economy approach to PSA allows us to rebalance the framework and capture the value as well as interest and process of institutional change. And I will leave it there and very much welcome any questions and discussion. Thank you.